Should a protest take place on Armistice Day? Are parents to blame for children missing school? And did the King's speech deliver? This is Politics Live. Joining me in the studio, the Conservative MP, Dame Andrea Leadsom, Shadow Science, Innovation and Technology Secretary, Peter Kyle, the political editor of The Mirror, John Stevens, and the editor of CapX, Alice Denby. Today, should a protest plan for Armistice Day go ahead?
There will be a protest this weekend. Parliament's very clear about that. The law provides no mechanism to ban a gathering, a static protest, a rally, anything like that.
My view is that these marches are disrespectful, and that's what I'll be discussing with the Police Commissioner later today.
But has the Israel-Gaza war exposed cracks in the leadership of the two main parties?
The figures that we're releasing today show that if things continue as they are right now, by 2025, 1 in 4 children will be regularly out of school.
Are parents to blame for the rise in children staying at home?
It's useless as a bill unless it can be put forward as a working bill, not just something that's there to keep people quiet, to quieten the victims.
Rhiannon wants the experience of victims to be improved, but is the government listening? Both leaders pitch themselves as candidates for change, but can they convince the public?
Above all, this King's speech delivers change.
Today's address shows just how ridiculous that posturing is.
As you heard in the headlines, the Metropolitan Police Chief has said this weekend's pro-Palestinian demonstration will go ahead against the wishes as expressed by Rishi Sunak and the Home Secretary Suella Braverman. The organisers say that the demonstration is in favour and calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. So, my opening question, starting with you, Andrea, is such a march fitting or disrespectful on Armistice Day when we commemorate the war dead?
I think it's incredibly disrespectful. I don't think anyone can be under any illusion that there will be those who want to see this as their opportunity to make their case. It won't be a sort of a quiet, simply a static protest looking for peace or a ceasefire. It will be people wanting to cause havoc. And at a time when millions across the country want to remember those who made the ultimate sacrifice. In my constituency, we have beautiful poppies that have been made by the WI and by local communities adorning our town halls. It is simply not an appropriate time to do it.
But the organisers have said it won't be anywhere near the cenotaph. It is billed as a peaceful demonstration. As you know, many people don't commemorate, of course, Remembrance Weekend. Football matches go ahead, people go shopping or even to the pub. But you still think it's disrespectful?
It's a very special day of remembrance for all of those who paid the ultimate sacrifice for our freedoms and our peace, so that people can demonstrate peacefully. But this is totally
fine. Well, on that, though,
appropriate.
is it then a fitting rather than disrespectful to hold such a march, which the organisers say is calling for peace, for a ceasefire in Gaza?
I wish the march wasn't happening, but the fact is, it is happening, and we now have to use our body politic to make sure that this day can continue with dignity and respect for people who want to use this day to mark remembrance. We have to bear in mind also that there has been a Public Order Act that has been passed this year by this government, and they spent a year of parliamentary time saying they needed all these extra powers to police protests. The year before, we had a Free Speech on University Campuses Act faced. So this is a government that is constantly legislating for, against free speech, the way that they police protests and free speech wherever it is. And now they're saying that a protest shouldn't happen and that they might need new powers. So we're in this situation. Our country is divided. People have the right, legal right and the moral right to protest. We need to make sure that our body politic is taking the heat out of this, and not, as we see with the Home Secretary, inflaming it. Almost you get the sense, hoping that there will be something that she can get her teeth into, because this is a government that wants to push divisions further apart.
Why
use hateful language and use the word hate about a protest in advance of a protest that hasn't happened yet? What we need to do is to take the heat out of this.
All right, but why has Suella Braverman called them hate marches? Do you not agree with her?
I absolutely believe in the right to peaceful protests.
But I'm talking about the language being used by the Home Secretary.
I'm not interested in the language that
she's
she's
the Home
used.
Secretary, Andrea.
No, I'm absolutely interested in Armistice Day, in Remembrance Sunday, being the opportunity for people to commemorate peacefully, as we do year in, year out, a core part of our national culture. And what I'm not interested in is Labour trying to make political capital out of it and start talking about... No, it isn't. It isn't OK for anybody to do it.
Right.
We should be absolutely as one, Peter, and I do believe we are as one, except that we're on air and so you're trying to make politics out of it. Armistice Day...
Well, let Peter respond to that, because that's quite an special day. Is that what you're doing?
I chose my words very carefully. We as a body politic need to take the heat out of this.
Exactly
I am calling out those politicians who are actually driving a wedge through
Adding heat to it.
Exactly, and I mean the Home Secretary.
Which is what you are doing.
The Home Secretary has the position to take the heat out of it and lead our country through difficult times when people do take to the streets.
Well, actually, while we're on this, then, it's not just the opposition, Andrea, because Saeed Avasi, former Conservative Party chairman, tweeted, "Far-right and football hooligans, main risk of disorder at pro-Palestinian march, police fear." This is what the Home Secretary has unleashed with her divisive rhetoric. Culture wars may win you headlines, but they damage our country. Does she have a point?
I mean, I don't agree with what Saeed is saying. What I have absolutely asserted is I think it is very disrespectful to protest on Armistice Day.
Is it fitting or disrespectful?
I think it would be sensible if the organisers held the march on a different day. There's no reason why it has to be on Saturday. But part of the reason I say that is because protests, you are trying to encourage people to come with you. We've seen with protests with Just Stop Oil, with Insulate Britain, they didn't bring people to their cause by doing things that were disruptive to members of the public. And so clearly, I think it is right that people are able to go out there and raise concerns about what is going on with Gaza, what is going on with civilians being killed, particularly children. I think that when that gets mixed in with poppy sellers feeling like they're intimidated, number one, that's unacceptable. And number two, it's not helpful for the cause that they are trying to put forward.
Fitting or disrespectful?
Yeah, I think I would just say to people considering going on these marches, thinking that perhaps it's a sort of blandly pro-peace or anti-oppression cause. It's not.
Which the organisers say.
I think that these marches give succour to a murderous terrorist ideology that hates everything that the West stands for and everything that we commemorate on Armistice Day. So I don't believe these should be banned. I think the right to freedom of assembly is vital to democracy, but I really think that anyone thinking of going on these marches should just stay at home.
Right. Can I bring up something that Pete raised, actually, which is the Public Order Act? Politicians have said in the run-up to this weekend that it's an operational matter. It's a matter for the police to decide. Well, they've decided. So why is Rishi Sunak meeting Sir Mark Rowley, head of the Metropolitan Police? Does he not agree or trust his decision?
It's vital that the police do take responsibility for operational matters, but last Saturday, just a few days ago, I was going out in town, went through Embankment Tube shortly before it was closed up because there was a sit-down protest of people shouting Israel is a terrorist state. Police were surrounding them, and I walked up to a police officer and said, "Why aren't you arresting people?" And that police officer said, "There are so many protests going on, we can't police them all. We don't have enough people here. If we start arresting people and it gets violent, we're worried we won't be able to cope." Prevention is absolutely critical. The Public Order Bill is designed to enable police to break up such disturbances. And in the end, they had to close the tube so that people who just wanted to go out on Saturday night couldn't do so. What we have to have is the right balance.
Right, but in terms of powers, you have got, or rather the police have been given extra powers. So are the police not using those powers, or do they need more?
Well, it is not apparent to me that the police need more. The Public Order Bill sought to give the police the powers they need. As Mark Rowley said, they don't have the powers to stop a peaceful, static protest. But what this sort of protests all over the place is designed to do is to create anarchy, so that there will never be enough police to be able to prevent that kind of hate being spewed on a Saturday night when people are just out trying to have a nice evening.
All right, well, let's talk about Labour Party, because there are divisions, as you know, within the Labour Party. 66 Labour MPs, a third of the party, have expressed views at odds with the party leadership when it comes to Israel, Gaza. They would like to see the leadership call for a ceasefire, not just a humanitarian pause. Let's just show you this headline. BBC News, Imran Hussein, Shadow Minister, quits Labour front bench over Gaza. He is the first one to do so. Why has Keir Starmer not been able to persuade so many of his MPs that he has the right policy?
Because what Keir's been focusing on is what actually unites the Labour Party at the moment, and actually that's what unites us as a country, which is we want an end to this war, but we also want that to be a point at which we move towards a peaceful long-term solution for the Middle East.
But why hasn't he persuaded so many of his party? He's failed to communicate his position.
No, actually, look, we are very proud of the fact that we have both traditions in our party, very well represented, who actually have an existential connection to what is happening. We don't downplay or underestimate how serious this is for many people in our country as well as around the world. What Keir has done is listened, engaged and come forward with a set of policies which are completely in line with not just our international partners, but also like-minded parties to the Labour Party as we are acting in around the world together.
Right.
Now, that means that we want to call for a humanitarian pause, get humanitarian activity in there, but it recognises, Joe, and this is the challenge for those people who want a ceasefire. As Anthony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, said today, people who do advocate for a ceasefire, they need to explain how they're going to get Hamas to release the hostages, how Hamas can be disarmed to a point where Israel can exist in safety.
The policy.
Because the onus isn't always on Keir to defend his position, which has been very, very well argued and stated.
Well,
for those people who do dissent, they need to explain how it will deliver success, because Keir has stated in international with partnership how it could conceivably change the nature of the conflict as it impacts citizens on the ground in Gaza today.
Alice,
others
do you not
have to
think
do the same.
people could be quite reasonably confused about what Keir Starmer's position on this is, given that he wanted Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister, a man who calls Hamas his friends? I think, you know, he's made it very clear that he wants to expel certain elements from the party, but I think people have every right to be confused. I don't think people know what he stands for.
Because people really seriously think that Keir Starmer supports Hamas.
I think it's a massive vulnerability. I think it's a huge vulnerability for the Labour Party. No, I agree with you. I think he's made pretty clear where he stands on this, but I think it's a huge vulnerability for the Labour Party.
Anyone paying attention over the last few years know that there's a big difference between Jeremy Corbyn and Keir Starmer.
I think there's a big vulnerability.
Keir Starmer backed Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom only a couple of years ago. All of the Labour front bench now backed Jeremy Corbyn.
Not all of the Labour front bench, not true.
Well, but the question here is, why hasn't Keir Starmer managed to persuade more of his party? I mean, the reasons we've heard here from Alice and Andrea, but more from within the party. How much disquiet is there?
Well, I think that the thing that Labour will be keeping an eye on now is, does this one resignation of a frontbencher put pressure on other frontbenchers who have raised concerns? I think it's 16 members of the front bench who've either said they want a ceasefire, they've done stuff like retweeting the UN Secretary-General. Does this one frontbencher resign, then put pressure on the other 15 or so to take more action? And we saw what happened when Sadiq Khan came out publicly and called for a ceasefire. Then within quite quick succession, you saw Andy Burnham and Anna Sawa do the same publicly. And I think this will put pressure on others to do the same.
Right. I mean, there is also now the potential for a vote in Parliament. Many of the MPs who have backed calls for a ceasefire are relying to some extent on the SNP. How would that happen, John?
So there's ways that you could hold some sort of vote as part of the debates on the King's speech, whether you try and get the Speaker to give you a sort of emergency debate with a vote attached to it. I think that the difficulty and the reason why the Commons Speaker may not allow that is because clearly you can hold a vote, but that's not going to be binding on Hamas. That is not something that the Parliament in the UK can legislate for.
Right, there'll be a lot of people who will think if Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, doesn't want this march to go ahead, why doesn't he stop it? Is that because he just doesn't have the leadership, putting aside the powers and laws, that he just doesn't have the clout to actually enact his wishes?
Well, it's not a matter of clout. It's a matter of fundamental democratic principle that you don't.
So he's going to try. He's going to try and persuade. He's going to try and persuade the Met Chief this afternoon to do exactly
to do the right thing. But it's really important that we uphold our democratic principles. Prime ministers don't decide who gets to protest or not. That is a police operational matter.
So why is he talking to him then? He's made the decision.
Because he's perfect. Because we have freedom of speech. So of course the Prime Minister can talk to the Chief of
to make him change his mind.
To persuade him, not to make him, no. And as you've heard, Mark Rowley so far is absolutely resisting and is determined to let these protests go ahead. But this is how the democratic
within the law
works.
of freedom of speech in this country that
this is
he can only stop the protests under certain circumstances.
Law which they passed this time, and when it's on, when we're talking about,
right.
and when we're talking,
but nevertheless, what we're all trying to say here, as you've yourself said, it would be great if people don't attend these demonstrations. I just gave an example. My Saturday night, half the people there were young white people, and I would ask them, when you shout from the river to the sea, which river are you talking about? Which sea are you talking about? Do you have any idea what you're talking about?
But we are all...
Hang on.
Let me just address this issue of unity. Just look at the last two conferences, the Tory conference and the Labour conference, and you just come to a conclusion, as the public have, as to which party is united. You see Suella Braverman calling homeless, being homeless, being rough sleeper as a lifestyle choice, sitting next to the Prime Minister, breathing down his neck yesterday, so he couldn't even roll back on those comments. So there is one party that is united about a future for Britain when it comes to foreign policy and domestic. There is another
that is
split
united,
right
Peter. You
down,
can't say that when you've got 66 MPs,
right down the middle.
MPs who are defying the leadership on this. In normal circumstances, you would admit anyone on the front bench would have been sacked.
Last week, Imran Hussain made a very passionate speech in the House of Commons, and he did so from a position on the front bench. We want to make sure that people can express their views on in an important existential issue like this, and we can harness that and show the leadership to put it into policies that can actually solve the challenge.
All right, we're going to move on because we're going to talk about the King's speech from yesterday. Let me just show you this. If you were watching Politics Live yesterday, which I'm sure you were, you will have seen some of the policies that we talked about announced by King Charles when he read out the government's agenda for the next year. And at the Conservative Party conference last month, the Prime Minister pitched himself as the change candidate. Here he says, the King's speech has set out this government's ambition for the future. We're taking long-term decisions with a single objective: to change our country for the better. Was it a reset moment for Rishi Sunak?
I think it really was, actually. I know there's been a lot of sort of meh about it, but actually...
From the Tory party, a lot of it, yes.
But you know, that is people, isn't it? You know, we're all used to this celebrity culture, so where's the pizzazz, you know? But actually, for my money...
Where's the policy?
It gave us, yeah, and absolutely, where's the policy? It's absolutely in that King's speech.
Okay.
So for the long term, the things like regulation for AI, a digital economy, driverless cars, putting into legislation new trade deals, that is the way of the future to increase productivity, to have jobs and growth around the world, to be a part of the future, the Indo-Pacific region where most of the world's growth is coming from, and then also to improve people's lives in the shorter term. So things like the Renters Reform Bill to give people much more security in their home. Things like a football regulator to protect people's local football clubs, and energy security, keeping the bills down whilst keeping the lights on.
Well, just briefly, you mentioned the Renters Reform Bill. What else was there from a retail perspective that's going to change people's lives in terms of cost of living?
So there's, for example, reforms to leasehold. So
but I've done the Renters Reform. I've done the Renters Reform. All right,
renters and leasehold
but broadly speaking, beyond that, what was there in the bill?
Security of your home is so important, Joe. Please don't belittle it.
No, I'm not.
Buy their own homes.
I was asking for other policies.
I have so many people on certain estates who've got a leasehold who are being ripped off by huge management charges for which they get nothing.
They still will if they're buying a house. They still will if it's a house.
Not if those leasehold reforms go ahead.
All right.
And there isn't the ability.
No, well, that's fair enough, and it is very important.
Law and order, incredibly important for people.
Another protest bill?
It's not
make it
funny.
3 in 3 years.
It's not funny, Peter. No, it's not.
Well, what's funny is you're wasting all this parliamentary time and it never does anything.
What it's about is protecting victims. So it's forcing
We're going to talk about victims in just a moment. But
no, but you're asking me what's retail.
I did. So
law and order is the first duty of a government, the security of the people, so that people can feel safer, so that women who are being stalked, harassed, having domestic violence perpetrated against them, so that those perpetrators will face them in the dock when they're sentenced, will go to prison and will not be released early on parole.
So
All of these things
less than
are
2% of the crimes
incredibly
you've just
important.
mentioned are actually being prosecuted. Less than 2%.
The sense of whether you feel safe or not is something that's fundamental.
All right. So you've talked about the leasehold reform and the renters reform bill and some of the criminal justice stuff, and we're going to talk about that. What was it you wanted to see in the King's speech?
Well, what we wanted is a Labour government with a missions-led government, a programme with 5 missions.
You haven't won the election yet. Hang on. Don't talk over each other.
To give. But what was really fascinating for me was almost everything that Andrea just mentioned wasn't in the King's speech in terms of legislation. No. So they mentioned AI, but no AI bill. They mentioned automated cars, no bill. Just what they're talking about is actually just tweaking some of the regulations, perhaps, going forward. Whereas we have the US, it's just legislated last week. We've had the EU, it's going to legislate before Christmas. All of these major territories steaming ahead. But our own government isn't actually legislating for any of this stuff. And what we had was this sort of mishmash of different things. We have a Prime Minister who's giving his first King's speech, who perhaps has 1 year before an election, maybe even 6 months. You would have imagined a clarity of vision. You would imagine some of the really big issues being tackled. The Victims Bill has been in the last 3 Tory manifestos. It has never been delivered yet.
All right.
Lots of the other stuff on renters reform is actually rolled over from the last Parliament.
Well,
this was just like sweeping up the floor of everything that's been left over for the last couple of parliaments and pretending it's a narrative for the future. This is an exhausted government that has no plans left, almost no legislation to back up its words in the King's speech. What we need, Joe, is a general election so we can have
you're going to get a general election. You're going to get a general election.
Let's have it soon.
What about Tory MPs themselves? Was there enough in that King's speech for them to sell on the doorsteps, like Andrea?
Not really at all. And you look at the infographics that MPs like Andrea got yesterday provided to them by Tory HQ to tweet out, and a lot of it was just totally made up. So on the idea that if you carry on doing oil and gas in the North Sea, that will bring bills down, even though the Energy Secretary's admitted that's not going to be the case, and suggesting because Labour want to invest in wind and nuclear, that is kind of giving succor to Putin. That is clearly not something that is true. And I think it's very difficult to sell stuff like that on the doorstep.
That is true.
I will, but I'll come back to you in a minute, because I just want to pick up on some of the things that we haven't discussed with Alice, and that is crackdown on youth vaping and smoking, a pedicabs bill for unlicensed cabs, and as part of the criminal justice bill, the police being able to enter premises without a warrant to seize stolen goods. Are these all things you support?
No, I mean, I think the best thing about the King's speech was the King himself. I thought it was magnificent. I think if there was a narrative to this speech, it was illiberalism and state overreach. I think things like the smoking ban is just fundamentally unprincipled. Just today came in the laughing gas ban. I mean, I don't know why Conservative government is doing this. We also have things like the Digital Markets Bill, which is going to see a huge expansion of the regulator into various tech, really important upcoming industries. So yeah, I'm afraid there's not much in it to like for people who care about their freedom.
I mean, all by one of those announcements has already been pre-announced or legislated for. Digital markets, last Parliament, being rolled over.
But hang on, Andrea, how conservative is this King's speech and everything that is in it? When you listen to Alice and the focus on bans, is it something that you're completely comfortable with?
There is not a focus on bans. To be very clear, in terms of vaping, I took up smoking when I was 14, gave up when I was 21. You show me an adult who smokes 40 a day and would like their children to take up smoking. So it's not a ban. What it is trying to get smoking out of our economy. There's a massive healthcare and cost to the taxpayer reason for doing that, which is something like 30% of all cancer as a result of that. So that's actually common sense.
All right, well, let her answer that and we'll come back to the rest.
Andrea, I used to smoke as well, and I gave up by taking up vaping. It's a safer product and an easy way for people to quit. And if you overregulate it and ban it, that's bad for public health.
There's not talk about banning.
But smoking, of course, is, well,
on the other hand, banning the plastic disposable vapes is actually very sensible. I mean, I don't know if you go and smell the bubblegum flavour disposable vapes, perfect pocket money size, you know, come on kids, take up vaping. This is a massive issue. This is absolutely targeting children.
But
so this is sensible. Ask parents. Very easy to sit here and say, don't ban things. And then also on the so-called illiberality of allowing police to go in without
Well, Jacob Rees-Mogg, David Davis have called it a fundamental mistake.
Yeah, well, you know, they might well have an opinion like that as backbenchers.
but
That's
they're wrong.
Absolutely right. But if you look at, for example, when iPhones are stolen, lots of people have Find My iPhone. I can say to you, Joe, my iPhone is over there. And if you're a police officer at the moment, you have to then go and get an arrest warrant. That is actually a very sensible measure. It
let the others respond,
technology
Andrea.
as opposed to being illiberal.
Do you agree with Jacob Rees-Mogg or Andrea on this?
I don't like this instinct to ban and over-regulate. I don't think it's very conservative, and I don't think it's, you know, good for a society where we should be valuing choice and treating people like adults.
The problem for Labour is that there isn't anything transformative or anything markedly different when it comes to the broad sweep of changes for people's lives, whether it's on cost of living, whether it's cutting NHS waiting lists, because, as you say, rightly or wrongly, you're not going to spend any more money because of the economic situation. Would you agree that at the moment there's very little to pick between the two?
I fundamentally disagree. Just take energy policy. We would get to 100% green electricity by 2030. We'd do it by expanding radically.
I'm talking about short-term changes to people's lives if you win the election next year.
This is 6 years, and that will have a demonstrable impact on people's bills. All of the stuff yesterday, it was like Labour were in office and they're legislating to try and get wedge issues with us themselves. They are not a government that's in government. They are a government that is obsessed with the Labour Party. So we have come forward with a set of policies that would lower the cost of people's bills. They've come up with a set of policies just so they can have a bust up with Labour on the doorstep.
No, can I
and the Energy Secretary himself said would not alter bills by one single penny. Not a single penny.
You obviously heard her say
that. Can I get you to respond to that,
these are the issues after. This is all about having wedge issues and bust-ups on protests, on energy, on oil.
Well, on that, let's have a look at The Sun. Harry Cole says, call for big giveaway will get a lot louder for Rishi Sunak after that damp squib King's speech. He's talking about the autumn statement. Do you agree?
Can I comment on the energy first, please? I'm happy to comment on Harry Cole or whoever else. But what is really important is that in energy, it is a trilemma: keeping the cost of bills down, keeping the lights on, and decarbonising. What Rishi has done is to really focus on keeping that balance. What Labour will do is they'll scrap our North Sea oil and gas resources. Even the Committee on Climate Change says we'll need oil and gas for at least the next 2 decades. The oil and gas sector creates about 200,000 jobs in the UK and billions to the Exchequer every year.
On your trilemma, just briefly, on your trilemma on the bills down, Claire Coutinho, the Energy Secretary, has said it will not bring energy bills down.
What will not bring energy bills down?
What you've announced in the King's speech.
No, because you see, that is... I'm literally trying to explain the energy trilemma. There are certain measures for energy security. One of those is that we don't want to be completely beholden
but that's separate to bringing people's bills down, Andrea.
No, those 3 things have to be in balance. If you scrap oil and gas, you immediately increase the cost because the absolute peak requirement for electricity
hang on, Andrea, you're just talking over everybody, and actually we just need to pin down a little bit of clarity. No, because even with the oil and gas licences, that was the question that was put to Claire Coutinho, by expanding oil and gas exploration, which may be the right thing to do, bills will still not come down.
So they will come down. The point about the expanding of oil and gas licences, so it's not a direct relationship.
No.
So the reason for legislating for the oil and gas licences is to give certainty to investment. Precisely because Labour have been flip-flopping over this issue, will they, won't they? So what the Conservatives are seeking to do is to ensure that we have an investable proposition in the North Sea.
Although most of it will be exported,
200,000 jobs. Of course it is, because it is sold on the international markets. But the point being...
All right, so when will energy bills come down? If you're going to the next election, you're on the doorstep. I'm a constituent. Andrea Leadsom, I can't afford my heating bills. When will they go down if I vote Conservative?
So there is an international price of gas, and at the moment our electricity comes off that gas price. What the UK is doing, looking at electricity reform to de-link electricity and gas. Electricity, because that comes largely from renewables.
All I'm asking is, when will it come down?
within the next 10 years.
Right, OK, that's all I needed to know.
Structurally,
so
but in the
Claire,
short term,
fine,
it's subject
fine,
to the
but I'm
international
talking
price of
about
gas.
the short term, because if an election is next year, that is what people
because
will want
energy
to know.
security is also critical, as is keeping the lights on.
And
what
you are doing the
Labour
same,
are
hang on,
risking
Peter,
is
you
the
are
lights
doing the
going
same.
out.
Wait a minute, you're
Andrea
doing the
has
same
just-
because you're not revoking, you're not going to
Precisely.
stand against the oil and gas
Precisely.
licences, and we'll see what happens when you're in government.
Which was just mischaracterised. We're not scrapping existing contracts. We're going to let existing contracts go forward and use that time to reconfigure our economy so that we have renewables and we have green electricity by 2030, by which time we will be lowering electricity prices. And had the plan we put forward 18 months ago gone through with a proper windfall tax, bills would have been lower right now today, and also 4% lower inflation according to the IFS. So the plan was there, they ignored it, bills are high.
So
and
I'm going to stop you there because otherwise we haven't
again.
got time for everything else. You've mentioned the Victims and Prisoners Bill a number of times around the panel, and it was the focus, criminal justice, in the King's Speech. Our Westminster correspondent, Shelley Phelps, has been speaking to a woman from North Wales who was taken hostage by her ex-partner about some of the changes she wants to see on victims' rights and the criminal justice system. Let's have a look.
This is the horrifying moment Rhiannon Bragg's ex-partner, Gareth Wynne-Jones, ambushed her with a shotgun, taking her hostage and leaving her fearing for her life. She'd had CCTV installed at her home to gather evidence against him after she'd reported him to the police for harassment months earlier, but no further action had been taken. Seeing him jailed was a huge relief. But Rhiannon says her experience of the criminal justice system was re-traumatising.
I found it incredibly confusing. There were huge parts I just didn't understand at all. I'd no idea what a lot of my rights were. It was a horrific time with everything that had happened, and it was made worse by the criminal justice system.
The CPS has apologised for causing profound distress in its handling of the case. Transforming victims' experiences is central to the government's Victims and Prisoners Bill. But Rhiannon says the plans don't go far enough, and that the government's decision to add provisions on prisoners to the bill since its draft version distracts from victims' issues.
Make it about the victims. Make it about protecting victims and giving victims the security that they need. I find it quite frankly insulting that the prisoners were brought into this bill in a relatively sudden way earlier this year. It needs to be to make sure that advocates are in place to guide people through, that sustainable funding is in place to finance all the changes that are being made. It's useless as a bill unless it can be put forward as a working bill, not just something that's there to keep people quiet, to quieten the victims, the people who stand up for victims.
Rhiannon talking there to Shelley Phelps. Now, this is from the Ministry of Justice, who've said the bill will place the foundations and the Victims Code on a statutory footing and put victims' voices at the heart of the justice system, improving their experience at every stage. Does sustainable funding need to be there in order to make this bill work?
Well, of course. I mean, at every level, that is just a horrifying story. I was looking at some of the footage of it this morning, and I mean, it's completely unacceptable. And for somebody who's gone through this type of experience to then not be properly looked after, and also, as she said, to have the sort of jargon not explained to her.
But will the funding be there to provide that sort of support, which is the difficulty?
Well, yes, it will be there.
Right, and all the way through. I mean, Rhiannon doesn't seem to think it will be there. I mean, the other thing she's worried about, Peter, is that stalkers and abusers who often get sentences of less than 12 months could be given suspended sentences. In other words, they don't go to prison or community orders due to prison overcrowding. Would a Labour government stop that?
Yes, so we've been proposing the Victims Bill has been in the Tory manifesto for the last three manifestos, and it hasn't actually come forward yet. Well, it has, but now finally come forward. Yeah. But actually, all they're doing is putting the code of conduct onto statutory footing, which means that, but there are no sanctions in the system for not upholding it. So only 20% of victims ever find out that they actually have rights as a victim. What we need to do is make sure that there are rape specialists in every force. There are rape specialists in every court.
How much will that cost?
Well, so these have been fully funded, and we're going to find the efficiencies from elsewhere in the system to fund it. But we need to make sure, because right now, since 2015, the number of reported domestic abuse cases has doubled. the number of convictions has halved. So we are in a real situation at the moment where 1 in 4 people who report sexual crime actually drop out before it gets to court because it's taking so long to get to court. They don't have the support through the system and they don't know they have rights. All of these things will be addressed with the victims bill that we've put forward, the government has rejected, and we will make sure that they have enforceable rights and there'll be sanctions in the criminal justice system if they ignore victims' rights.
Right. I mean, does that sound like a better version of the bill that you've announced in the King's Speech?
Well, as is already the case, there is a Victims Commissioner for England and Wales, and there's something like 1,000 specialist advisors to help victims. I completely sympathise with Rhiannon's experience. It sounds as though she had a terrible experience, and the CPS have apologised, the Crown Prosecution Service, for the way they treated her. But it's certainly a huge priority for the government to ensure that all victims of stalking, harassment, domestic violence, rape are getting the sort of support that they need. And there's been a huge amount of activity in that area, as well as new funding. The government has expanded the prison actual capacity.
Well, but it's still right up at the limit.
It's the biggest new prison building since the Victorian days.
It's all well saying that the King's Speech is all about law and order and how Tories are tough on crime. But anyone can pay attention to the news on the other days of the week and see that the Tories are having to let criminals out early from prison because there isn't room to lock people up.
All right, I'm not going to... We're going to leave it there because I want to talk about school absences, also a big issue, because it's massively increased in the past few years. In England, in 2016-17, 10.7% of pupils were persistent absentees, which means they've missed 10% or more of school sessions. In 22-23, it was 21.2%. Now, Bridget Phillipson, the Labour Party's Shadow Education Secretary, said this number could reach 2 million children, or 1 in 4, by the middle of the decade if rates continue to rise. Let's talk to Dr Sally Burtonshaw, Associate Director at consultancy Public First, who's been researching this issue. Your research, Sally, and welcome to the programme, has found that the idea that every day in school matters has been abandoned by mums and dads. Why?
Oh, thanks very much. Yeah, we spoke to parents from across the social spectrum, and parents gave us very clear feedback that they felt that attendance at school no longer mattered every day. This seems to be sort of really pushed by a breakdown between schools and parents, and that looked different across the socioeconomic spectrum. So our poorer parents talked about sort of mistrust of school. Coupled with the idea that schools were very much the final resort for all sorts of challenges that they were facing, really exacerbated by the cost of living crisis and the decline in other services and mental health services and support for children with special educational needs. Wealthier parents also talked to us about a sort of apathy around school, just that they didn't feel, as long as their child was doing okay, and they just didn't feel that missing a day was important anymore.
All right.
And crucially, parents felt that sort of it was about other people's children rather than theirs. So when we talked about the attendance crisis with them, they all felt that their children attended enough, and even when perhaps the data didn't quite suggest that.
All right, Sally, stay with us. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so a colleague of Sally's, Ed, actually wrote a piece in CapX about some of these focus groups we've been doing, where we've heard from middle-class parents saying, oh, well, I'll just take my kid out of school for a cheaper skiing holiday during term time. This is a fundamental breakdown of the social contract between parents and schools. And I think the closure of schools during COVID has a lot to do with it, but I also think industrial action has broken trust between parents and teachers. I think if people are thinking, well, if a teacher can decide that my kid doesn't need to be in school, why can't I?
Right. What do you make of the break of social contract? The idea that children must go to school every day out of necessity and a moral duty to get an education.
Well, I think that is worrying if that is happening. We know that the impact this does have. I think it was a report from the Children's Commissioner last weekend found that children who missed more than half their lessons in their final 2 years of the GCSEs, only 1 in 20 of them got 5 good GCSEs, which is perhaps not surprising. But those children, what is their future? You know, those are very formative years. If you don't get GCSEs, are you going to go on to A-levels? Are you going to get a degree? Are you going to be able to fulfil your potential? But I think we can't just blame everything on parents. There will be a lot of parents whose children aren't 5 or 6, they're 15 or 16, and they're struggling to get their children to go to school. And when they look for help from the state, They cannot get help with things like mental health. They're just told that the wait to get help is too long. And that's fine if you're a middle-class parent, you can just go private. But if you are one of those low-income parents, what are you meant to do? You can't afford to send your child to some private mental health help.
Andrea, are parents to blame for this breakdown and massive increase?
Yeah.
I mean, it's always happened, but this massive increase.
Yeah, well, certainly, I mean, the marked increase has got to be related to COVID, doesn't it? I mean, the closure of schools, and, you know, I think all politicians, I mean, Labour wanted to keep schools closed for even longer than the Conservatives did, and I think there's no doubt that there's huge learning from that, and that has been devastating. There has been huge investment in trying to get kids learning back on track.
But it's not
of course,
worked,
it's the attendance. No, it hasn't. And actually, what I would say, I'm the government's early years advisor, and we are opening family hubs right across England. And the idea is that those, with a focus on the very earliest years, but will actually offer support to families right up to children of age 19 and 25 where there's disabilities, so that will be a welcoming.
But do you think the social contract
support
has been broken in the way Alice said?
I think that is a very difficult question. I would add to that the one of homeschooling. I mean, I really worry about the number of children whose parents have just decided, I'm just going to homeschool them. What are those children doing? Are they actually being schooled at all? Are they being shut away? You know, the socialisation of schools.
No, I mean, well, this headline, so working from home parents blamed for letting children skip school. The idea that, of course, they're at home. So if they do... I mean, what would you do about it? Would you punish parents?
I mean, at the moment, the responsibility for school attendance lies with the local authorities, and as we know, some of them are absolutely rigid in terms of fining parents for days missed, etc. But I do think there are some very real issues. I mean, in my own constituency, I have parents whose children are being bullied in school, so they don't want to go to school, parents with children who have mental health issues, so they can't face getting up in the morning. So I think it potentially the social contract is bending, but I do think that it's for local authorities, for schools to get to grips with it, and of course for politicians to make the case your children need to be in
young people
school.
themselves at the moment are facing a real perfect storm. So just the societal changes has meant a lot of pressure on young people just from social media and the way that pressure and bullying is put on young people as well. On top of that, we had COVID. This generation who's now in secondary school, they had a torrid time, and never forget that we had one of the weakest school recovery and student recovery programs of any comparable country. Rishi Sunak said that he had maxed out on support for young people when we were spending 30 times less per pupil than comparable European countries. So that's one issue that's going through.
And what about fines for parents if kids are playing?
Let's just look at if we want to solve this problem, you've got to look at the driving causes of it. At the moment, mental health is really there. Young people who are exhibiting mental health challenges get very little support. So what we want to do is make sure there is a trained mental health support person in every school. We want to make sure that every community has a mental health support person. We want to make sure that there are a lot of parents who are worried they have to work very long hours and they're sending their kids to school hungry. We want universal free school meals for the morning, a breakfast club for every primary school.
Will that
fully
work?
funded.
But Peter, will that work against what you've just heard from Sally? And that is actually that belief that it is critically important for kids to go to school every day is being loosened, let's put it that way, from the research.
You can blame parents for having to work and not be able to support kids who are exhibiting mental health challenges, distress, anxiety before going to school. Or you can create the situation where those kids are supported in school and they go into work, into school hungry, with a breakfast. And yes, it was such a shame that Andrea and her party voted to rip family hubs out of every community.
All right, well, let's not go back to
But it is great that they are now getting interested in what they pulled out in the first place, because families need support, and some families need a lot of support. They should be getting it in the community.
Alice,
mental health support,
what about teacher
family
strikes?
support.
Do you think that's undermined the social contract?
That's certainly one of the layers. Of course I do. And the teacher strike should never have happened in the first place.
Let me go back to Sally.
That would have engaged with the teachers.
Let me just go back.
To head it off in the first place.
Sally, listening to everything here, is mental health, the mental health of young children, the main driver here for kids not going to school?
It's certainly a significant driver, yes. Our parents reported back to us that mental health played a huge role, whether that was the crisis in camps that mean that children can't access care and there are huge waiting lists, but also a sense that children were feeling much more anxious, and therefore individual days off for mental health and well-being, and perhaps even before it becomes crisis, were really kind of at the forefront of what parents were telling us, absolutely. Compounded by a cost of living crisis that meant that kind of families as a whole were feeling much more anxious. It felt like attendance is very much a window into many of the other challenges that are facing schools. So the teacher recruitment and retention crisis came up, as did mental health, as did the idea of not being able to access key services, and also really compounded by the challenges that children with special educational needs face as well.
All right, Sally Burton-Shaw, thank you very much. Is this going to become a really crucial issue at the next election if those numbers keep rising?
Yeah, and I think that one of the problems here is you cut funding for things like councils and youth services, and in the instant, at the immediacy, you don't see any difference, and then over years you see why this does make a difference.
Thank you to all of my guests for joining me today. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. From all of us, bye-bye.